So here we are after a year, and we're still talking about fake news. The good news is we're going to solve it. The bad news is we've got 18 minutes to solve it. Joe, let's start with you. Donald Trump, barely a week goes by without him saying that more or less everything your newspaper produces is fake news.
Yeah.
Hasn't fake news just become an all-purpose insult for people to throw at news they don't like?
Yes, it has. And I think it's probably useful to start by acknowledging that Donald Trump has elevated the issue of fake news, but his definition of what fake news is, to put a fine point on it, is fake. Fake news is a very clearly identifiable thing. It is news or information that's created to resemble news, but it has nothing to do with actual news. It's fraudulent content created with the purpose of going viral on the internet, usually for a political purpose, sometimes for an economic purpose. But the Pope endorses Donald Trump for president is an actual piece of fake news that has no factual basis, has no resemblance to an actual news story, except for what you might call identity theft of the news business.
So, Yaron, you've got very hands-on experience, as it were, of this kind of material on your own platform, Outbrain. If we take Joe's definition, how big a problem is it actually, or have we all got a bit hysterical about a very small amount of content?
Yeah, so I think Joe's two buckets, basically, of the fraudulent content, one being financially driven, people creating content that's much cheaper to produce. You do that Trump story, and it costs you almost nothing. And it's driven for basically advertising and getting money. The other bucket is the political driven, the Russia meddling, et cetera. So I'll start with the political one. I think it's very hard to quantify, and where the real problem is on social networks. I think what much of that, the political driven fake news is trying to do is really get people to share and not pay a lot of money for it. And so I think that's clustered more in Facebook and Twitter. We saw Facebook going from saying it's not a problem at all to maybe touch a couple million people to basically the entire United States was affected by it. So I think it's a pretty big problem, but I think it is clustered where people can share the news and it can spread without money being involved. On the paid side, about 5 years ago, I think we coined the term fake news or fake content for the first time at Outbrain. We noticed that a lot of news, or what was looking like news, was actually fraudulent, and we decided in a single day to just cut it all out of Outbrain. That, just to give you a sense of quantity, was about 25% of the entire company's revenue, and we got rid of that, and since then we've been pretty good at.
And how did you decide what was fake or fraudulent?
So it's a very difficult thing. We were just talking about this backstage. It's difficult to weed out everything, and it is a cat and mouse thing where the smarter you get, there's big financial incentives. But there are fingerprints that if you put your head around it and you try to look for it and you put your team around it, there are fingerprints.
What sort of fingerprints?
So I'll give you a couple of examples. When the New York Times publishes a story, the publish date is not going to change. That story just ages as it ages. When folks are creating content to try to game the system and make money, they keep moving the publish date because then they get re-ranked on the platforms like Facebook and Google. So crawling the sites and looking for changing publish dates. Another good example is many times these are news stories. They're made to look like news stories, but a news story by definition is going to be covered by a large number of organizations. And so if you suddenly have a news story that's getting a lot of traffic and no other news organization has covered it, that's a good fingerprint right there that it's a problem.
So, Anne, you think about these things from a European and a policy perspective. Yaron makes it sound really easy for tech companies to clean up their act. Are the other big tech companies doing a good enough job of doing what he did?
Well, I think we could do better, and I think we must do better. And that is certainly part of the job of the companies, as you say. But I also see a world in which we, as users and consumers of news, will have to start to become a little bit our own editors. You know, we need to be able to discern what is real news and what is fake news. So for instance, if you only read a breaking news story in one outlet, chances are it's not real. So I think I see a world in which we're going to, more of the onus is going to be on the user, but that's not to take away any of the responsibilities of the companies, because certainly I think the onus is on them to do better, because this disinformation campaign, and I think we must have no illusion about it, is essentially an attempt to completely destabilize liberal democracies.
Is it working?
I think so. In parts of the world, yes. I mean, I definitely see it. We're fortunate that in the EU 27, I think maybe we've been a little bit more resilient because it's partly a language issue. It's probably more difficult to produce fake news in some of the languages that we have in Europe. But I also think, largely speaking, the media landscape in many European countries is a little bit different than it is elsewhere, because media is not just like any other industry. I mean, media is in many ways the backbone of our democracies, because we need informed citizens in order to, to take a good and informed decision at the ballot box. So I think that has helped us, as well as I would say that probably in continental Europe we have higher levels of sort of social cohesion, maybe fewer people that feel like they're completely left out by the system.
Joe, you think the tech companies are doing enough to clean up their act?
I think the tech companies are at a very early stage still of recognizing that part of what built their business model as aggregators of all kinds of content, and content to them really didn't have much differentiated value. They were aggregating content, the more the better, serving it up based on algorithms, based on what their users liked or the amount of emotion that users showed toward any individual piece of content. That model is under threat from what we're calling fake news, or what really we should be calling fraudulent news. Yeah. Because content is not all created equal. Good quality journalism is an entirely different thing from fraudulent news reporting that has a political or an economic purpose to it. And the basic business model of many of the platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, of allowing user-generated content and all kinds of undifferentiated news content to be collected and distributed based on their own secret algorithms.
You're describing Yaron's business here, right?
Well, no offense to Yaron, but I think that a lot of the tech world, and particularly the social media world, was built on the idea that content is cheap, it's a commodity, and the only value added is to aggregate it and distribute it in a user experience that's superior to someone else's. I do think that's under threat.
You need to come back on that, Yaron. You built a model which basically devalued high-quality content.
Oh, I don't see it that way. The way I think about Outbrain is a way to support journalism in a way that's much better than advertising. I think maybe going back to the original question, maybe some of the problem is that we are calling them tech companies. To me, Facebook is just the biggest publisher in the world. They aggregate people's attention. They do it by serving them content, and they sell it to advertising. They use technology behind the scenes. I think the exact same definition or description would apply to the New York Times. The New York Times has technology in their CMS, they sell ads, and they aggregate people's attention. I think once the Silicon Valley, and we're not, we're New York, we're much more in the publishing world, I think once the Valley tech companies start thinking about themselves with the media responsibilities.
So you're acknowledging then that you're a publisher, right?
We're not a publisher. We're much more of a tech company in that sense.
Why are you different from Twitter or Facebook in that regard?
Well, where the user goes to. The user goes to Facebook and Twitter and the New York Times. They don't go to Outbrain. We power the technology for the publishers.
Okay, we'll let you off on that one for now. But Anne, Yaron says these big platforms are publishers and we should just recognize that. Do you think that's right? I
can't say yes or no, but it is an issue that we're going to look into because I mean, fake news is really in the process of eroding our democracies. And so it's a very, very serious issue that we at the European level have been working on, but are going to be doing much more. So since 2015, for instance, we have a unit within our External Action Service that does nothing than to follow all the disinformation coming out of Russia about the EU. So this is a full-time team, 10 people. It used to be called the East Stratcom because this was mostly a problem for Eastern Europe. It's now moved to all of Europe. So this is something we have been doing since 2015, but we're going to be doing much more. There's going to be a public consultation. There will be a high-level group on fake news, and this is really coming to the fore now because we're all for digitalization. We like it, but not at the expense of our democracy. So I think we need to be very clear, and it's time to stop being naive about these issues.
So I can see that you're operating a kind of rebuttal operation, but can you just be a bit clearer about what actual regulatory levers you could pull? Why don't you just start a new Ministry of Truth?
No, there won't be a Ministry of Truth, and it would certainly not be for public authorities to create such a thing. However, I think we must maybe be looking at other issues. For instance, is it right to target political ads according to someone's psychological profile? So, I mean, maybe these are some issues that we can be looking at. Last year, I spoke on this very stage in a panel called Will Technology Kill Democracy? And back then, this is 1 year ago, we were just talking about the echo chambers and the red feed and the blue feed on Facebook. What all have we learned since last year about what has happened? And what more are we going to learn? So the point is, in Europe, we are not naive about disinformation. This has been going on for a long, long time, and it is meant to completely disorient a population. So we're going to be taking actions because we have to. There's too much at stake.
Joe, is it time Facebook, Google were just regulated as publishers?
Thank you.
Facebook and Google, I would disagree a little bit with Yaron on this. I think that they are very eager, in fact, determined at the moment to avoid having the label publisher or media company applied to the business that they're in. A publisher or a media company acknowledges by that very label that they have responsibility for what they publish. The accuracy of it, the usefulness of it, is part of the inherent responsibility of a publisher or broadcaster. Facebook and Google are at an inflection point at the moment where they're trying to decide whether or not they have responsibility for the information and the news, whether it's fraudulent news or real news, that is actually circulated on their platform. And they've sent different signals at different times about whether they should take responsibility for that. There's a massive amount of content. It would require an enormous investment of engineering resources and human resources to actually sort that content out and put it into any kind of quality classification. And on the one hand, they're signaling that with the interference of Russia in the American election, they need to start doing that. On the other hand, are very eager not to be labeled media companies and to start being regulated like media companies. So I think that we're hearing conflicting things from them, and I think it's a bit of an existential crisis.
Which way do you think they should be going?
I mean, my personal view about it is that neither Facebook or Google is anywhere close to being a media company in the sense that we have typically thought of media companies as producing, or in some cases aggregating content that they're in any position to stand behind, put their brand name behind, their reputation behind. Their scale of content that they're aggregating is many orders of magnitude greater than anything a publisher could produce. And their business model depends on them being a somewhat neutral platform for other publishers and for other media companies. But at the same time, because they've become such an influential way of people to get their news and information, they've inherited some of the responsibilities of a publisher and broadcaster. Ultimately, it's going to be up to them in terms of some degree of self-regulation and up to governments to try to actually classify what kind of companies these are. Are they utilities? Are they media companies? In what way should they be regulated and overseen by the public?
Yaron, do companies like yours accept that we are coming, as it were, to the end of the Wild West period of the internet, and that now is the moment when the regulatory environment is having to catch up with the reality of where technology and business is, and that you will face a new kind of regulatory environment?
So I think there's a lot that's wonderful in the Wild Westness of the social networks, and I really hope that a lot of it stays. I think the definition of what a tech company or a publisher is, I think, is probably more shades of gray, and I think where we need to go is probably go to the whiter side. At Outbrain, for example, about a quarter of the company's employees are responsible or have a responsibility in their job for looking at the content that makes it into the index and decide if it makes it in or not. So, going back to the profitability that you talked about and their business models, I think that taking some of that profitability and putting it into stricter guidelines is important. On regulation, I'd hate to see flushing the baby with the bathwater and just preventing all speech. It's also, I don't think, the place of government, especially in the U.S. But I do think that better regulation, the way I'd like to think about it is nutrition labeling for sugar. So you don't say sugar is illegal just because it's bad for people, but the government should be the one saying this is how nutrition labels should look across all food. And I think that's where government can help. That and education, making sure our people are educated to look and understand what they're reading.
Anne, you got a lot of enthusiasm in the room a little earlier when you said you're really on the case and you're really going to do something about this. But can I press you just a little bit more about what that might look like? Because in the end, the question here is how you police truth, right? That's why we have libel laws. Can you just tell me what it is you could actually do, either to make these big companies root out stuff that is wholly untrue, or to punish them when it's there?
I mean, when I hear it takes so much effort to do a better job, I will tell you one thing: you also need a lot of resources when your democracy disassembles. So I think we just need to, at the first stage, understand the issue better. And I think even comparing to last year, we're seeing, we're understanding it better. So I want to be crystal clear. I'm not calling for regulation, but what I am saying is we really, really need to understand it better. And the time to be naive is over. And the second thing I have to say is you cannot just look at fake news in isolation, because you have fake news, you have hate speech, you have modern terrorism wouldn't be possible without the internet. You have economic espionage. All of this, yesterday there was a session on cyber wars, So we need to look at it in totality and understand that right now there are many things that are going wrong. And I want to be clear, we all like digitalization. We embrace it. I know that social media is here to stay, but we need to make it compatible with our democratic systems and beliefs. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, we're out of time. That was a great conversation. I want a one-word answer from each of you to a quick-fire round. I would like to know, as a percentage, what your level of confidence that everything that you read in the following places is true. Joe, what's your percentage level of confidence in everything in the New York Times?
My level of confidence in everything the New York Times publishes is 100%.
Yaron, everything that appears on Outbrain?
Politically, very high in the high 90s, commercially, 80s.
And what's your level of confidence in the veracity of everything you read in the European media about the EU?
There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding sometimes about the EU. But I have to say, the highest approval ratings for a long time in the EU right now. So it's been very reassuring.
Thank you very much for a terrific chat.
Thanks.